should be joining us at any minute. I just had a few words exchanged with him. As soon as I have confirmation that the Commissioner is connected, we can kick off formally the meeting. The way it will be held is the usual format. I will say a few introductory words. The Commissioner will give us his message. And then if you wish to intervene, please raise your hands. And I will take them in batches of, let's say, 4 or 5 questions at a go. As always, please try and keep them as short as possible and as concise as possible so that we can fit in as many questions as possible. I encourage you, of course, all to participate in a very active manner. Can somebody from the Secretariat advise, please, when the Commissioner is connected?
We confirm that the Commissioner is connected.
The Commissioner is connected. Okay, so we can start off. Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner, and thank you once again for coming to this meeting. It is indeed with great pleasure, and it is an honor for me to greet you at this extraordinary group meeting of the Employers Group of the European Economic and Social Committee. I would like to greet you first and foremost as the Commissioner responsible for some of the most important portfolios for us, such as industrial policy, SME policy, and even space policy. I would, however, also like to greet you here as an important partner, a partner to a thriving and strong European economy. As employers, we feel that with you we can speak the same language, and this is crucial at these times of unprecedented challenges. You have served as French Minister of Economy, Finance and Industry. You have been a professor at Harvard Business School, but above all and most importantly, you have been at the helm of businesses, taking day-to-day decisions to keep businesses growing and creating value. You know how important it is that we as entrepreneurs have a legislative environment that allows us to operate with certainty, flexibility, and security. We are all very much looking forward to listening to what you have to say to us and to exchanging views with you on a number of key issues. I would, however, like to touch very briefly on the vaccine rollout for which you have now been made responsible. Your hands-on approach to securing a rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines, I've seen you in the press visiting the factories, so to secure a rollout of the vaccines in a timely and consistent manner is extremely welcome. It is clear that it is only through a massive and timely delivery of vaccines to our citizens that we can start to regain a certain amount of stability and confidence, both ingredients of which are extremely important for a speedy and strong economic recovery. We are fully aware of the difficulties being faced. However, we are confident that industry is reacting in the right manner. Production capacities are being pulled together, and with your steady hand, we are confident that the right policy decisions will be taken. In a statement we issued a few weeks ago, we urged the Commission and the Member States to maintain a sense of collaboration and solidarity, as it was these two elements which brought us this far in such a short span of time. In a recent speech, a few days ago, you said, with the vaccines being developed in record time, we have won the battle of science. We now have to win the battle of industrial production. The Employers Group is, however, firm in its conviction that protectionism is never the way forward, and that any such action is likely to backfire and create new problems for the continued development and production of vaccines. At the same time, whilst vaccines continue to be rolled out, we need to make progress on the use or otherwise of common vaccination certificates and or vaccination passports, which could also play a crucial role in bringing further confidence to the market. In saying this, I'm fully aware that this is a sensitive and somewhat controversial issue, which, however, needs to be tackled with an open mind and an understanding that what we are facing is unprecedented and therefore requires unprecedented approaches. To conclude, we are confident, dear Commissioner, that if we approach this challenge together as a European Union, we will overcome this very difficult time and we will emerge stronger and in a better shape to face the significant challenges and opportunities related to the digital and green transitions on which I am sure we will exchange views. Dear Commissioner, these are just a few of the many issues we need to tackle together in partnership. I will not hide away from the fact that we as employers are somewhat preoccupied by some of the agenda items of this Commission. And here I could mention the minimum wage and also the action plan for the social pillar, and also the pay transparency initiative, which is coming up. However, to make sure that I am not misunderstood, we believe that business can and wants to propose solutions for the manifold simultaneous transitions taking place. We firmly believe that business and enterprise is an indispensable partner to adapt our societies to the future and should be given the room to play its role. Human-centered AI, effective climate policy, or other public goods cannot be brought about by business or the market alone, but neither can they be brought about without the role of business. Dear Commissioner Breton, we are looking forward to hearing from you, following which we will then open the floor for an exchange with our members. Mr. Commissioner, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and this kind words. Maybe if you allow me, I may switch in French because I think that you have a translation. So, je vais parler maintenant en français.
Stefano, dear members of Group 1, allow me to begin by saying what a great pleasure it is for me to be able to join you in this meeting today. We're going to be discussing some issues that are very important, some important issues that are relevant to us. I'm looking at your concerns, everything that you have expressed in the opening remarks, and I share a lot of that with you. It's very important for the prosperity of businesses, of citizens, to be mindful of these things. They're very relevant for the European continent as a whole. So, I've got some introductory remarks to make. I'm going to structure it as follows. First of all, there are certain things that are very relevant here. Sometimes we forget this, and some don't want to, they shy away from this, but they don't want to admit the fact that Europe is a major or the most important industrial player. My ambition is to fulfill this industrial ambition as well. We have everything in our favor to go down this road, and for us to become to fulfill our ambitions. So, industrial ambition is important. But what is industrial ambitions without SMEs that are in good health? SMEs are in the front line. 80% of SMEs in 2020 saw their turnover decrease significantly, and 2 out of every 3 had to delay investment decisions by quite some way. SMEs, well, job losses were huge, very in the millions. So what could be done? Well, the pandemic clearly had a very big impact. So a number of decisions had to be taken, and of course some of the decisions that were taken, for example, for health reasons, were inevitable. Public authorities did indeed have to take these decisions in order to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. As you know, we did try to take some mitigating measures. There was the SURE initiative, for example, the European Fund as well. The idea was to provide some funding for certain unemployment measures. So there's the SME strategy, some key actions there on venture capital for startups. There's been a COVID-19 dimension that was added onto certain mechanisms, such as the Oikos alert mechanism. Of course, beyond that, one does have to be mindful of the risk. At the beginning of my career, I was very familiar with how an SME works, so we know what can happen when you have situations such as these, when it's very difficult to get the right liquidities, etc. This is the reason why we tried to act very swiftly together with member states and to set up an environment that would enable us to support SMEs, given the major risks that we're facing. Financial pressure increased in 2020. We know this, especially, of course, when you got emergency measures in place that were then that began to be lifted. So there was a real transition, and a transition is certainly very topical. Still, it's a subject matter that we do attach a great deal of importance here in the Commission. Now, something else, it's very relevant here, that was brought to the fore in 2020. And we know that the situation from 2020 is far from being left behind us. We need to be mindful still. We're very mindful about helping member states. The European Observatory has been set up to provide aid to the construction sector, but that's the short term. We need to make sure that we also have a longer term outlook. So March 2020, the SME strategy, that's the sort of still guiding compass, if you will, when it comes to providing support to European SMEs. And it covers the three types of, the three dimensions that we need: sustainability, digitalization, future digitalization as well, and also will help businesses to further strengthen their resilience. I'd like to underline the role played by the Europe Enterprise Network, especially when it comes to businesses in terms of sustainability. And this is something that we started in 2020 to make sure that the new forum of digitalization renewal sees the light of day, to ensure that businesses can use this. There's digital innovation that needs to be integrated in the daily processes in businesses, and the Commission is providing a fast-track digitalization stream to enable SMEs to become more competent in areas such as cybersecurity, AI, but cybersecurity in particular is very important for SMEs. And anything to do with data hubs. So there'll be training for this in April, and a second stream of training in June 2021. So this is one of the ideas that we've put in place, and this has been work carried out together in conjunction with Commissioner Schmidt, whose portfolio covers this area of employment and social affairs. So in this context, we've also launched a Pact for Competences. There's 2 billion euros to be invested in professional requalification by 2025 for the electronic sector to begin with. But of course, yes, we look at the internal market ecosystem by ecosystem, because each ecosystem has, after all, its own dynamic. And the stakeholders within each ecosystem have their specific characteristics. So we want to make sure that this strategy for training is implemented. So you've got to look at it from a sector-by-sector point of view as well. Tourism, the automotive industry, totally different needs. So much for that. Now, moving on to industrial strategy. We're happy to see that the work carried out last year is on the right track. We look at this from a competition point of view as well. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted a certain number of needs, notably the urgent need to improve our strategic autonomy, all the while preserving trade links that are based on rules that guarantee loyal competition. This type of autonomy has indeed become a need that has been signalled as desirable, not just in Europe as a whole, but more particularly by SMEs. So this is about forming synergies, strategic synergies, that will enable us to be more industrially sustainable. So there's plans of synergies between the civic, spatial, military and defense industries. As you know, there is an action plan on the synergies between these industries, civil, spatial and defense. So the idea is to have these strategic plans in place and enable dual applications where possible. The internal market now, my third point that I'd like to address now, and resilience of the internal market. The pandemic has really highlighted how important the internal market is. After all, the price to pay behind this pandemic has been felt across many different sectors, and of course the internal market has an important role to play. Resilience is something that we want to achieve, but how can we have resilience without a fully operational single market? Better access for our SMEs is something that needs to be achieved, and also efforts made to aid startups. So the platform Fit for Future has been set up in order to provide a simplified access to EU legislation. There was the Day of the Industry that took place last week, so we heard about work that's going to be carried out on a new instrument aimed at strengthening the internal market. Stefano and I were able to have an exchange of views on this just before. We've got this something that needs to be pursued actively, member state by member state, minister by minister. Everyone will have their role to play. This sort of work is it's painstaking work. It's not easily achievable, but to have that sort of instrument in place that will enable us to have a better capacity, a better ability to intervene will have been worth it. It'll be an important thing to have. Yes, the implementation of services, services as well as 3/4 of GDP, 9 new jobs out of every 10 in the EU stem from that. Now, last but not least, industrial policy and what's to come. Looking at Next Generation EU, it's unprecedented, the levels of financing that we'll see here in the context of Next Gen EU. These are very significant amounts that we're going to have, that we're going to be able to deploy across different areas of importance. Because after all, we do need to begin to redefine, to build the industrial Europe of tomorrow. As you know, there's the Green Deal to think about, significant investment in green matters, the digital transition as well, digitalization, and of course resilience, autonomy, and sovereignty in certain areas, and a sound value chain. So there are certain technologies, very important things that happen on a cross-border basis as well. It's important looking at the figures. As you know, 37% of the funds available for that are earmarked for green technologies, and the measures that will help us attain carbon neutrality by 2050. And there are certain it could be a number of things that are envisaged here, 5G corridors being one of them, for example. Europe must not and cannot be too dependent when it comes to critical infrastructure on others. So here I'm thinking in particular of the industrial cloud, for instance. That's just one example. So these are very interesting matters. I'm happy to take questions from you, so as to ensure that we have a good balanced exchange of views in terms of what the industrial Europe of tomorrow means. Dear colleagues, what else can be done? We've got the current backdrop, we have what we have. Of course, there's something I haven't mentioned, but it perhaps is worth mentioning here, the pharmaceutical industry. We've got the authorizations that we have, 3 out of the 5 existing, 3 vaccines that were also that benefited from European money. Europe will be certainly a leader when it comes to production capacity of vaccines. This is important because businesses need to be able to follow that. Of course, to think about neighboring countries, countries that are neighbors, are friends. I'm thinking about Africa as well. And of course, we all know what the dimension of the pandemic is. So we need to be able to make sure that we have the capacity to address these various dimensions. Once you talk about vaccines, there is a lot of ground to cover there. They are as well a key part of our strategy for recovery and what we're going to see after this pandemic, after this crisis as well. So this is a part of our mission, and it's certainly something that I am aware of. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for inviting me here today, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. We'll take the first 4 questions. We'll do them in rounds of 4. As I said in the chat, it's Thomas Kropp, then we have Antje, Mira Maria, and Pietro Dell'Otto. So please press speak, and when the first question is done, please then the second one, Antje, takes the floor. Thomas, you have the floor.
Ja, ich werde in Deutsch bleiben, Herr Kommissar.
I'll speak German. Mr. Commissioner, I come from the aviation industry, which is not your area of competence, but there is no industry which is as affected by the pandemic as aviation and tourism. And this on the internal market and the way in which the internal market interacts with other regions in the world. And could I just come back to what is currently being discussed in Council, which is EU air traffic and the air traffic agreement with Qatar. The aviation industry takes the view that this is the worst moment to enter into a major air traffic agreement, which would weaken the aviation industry even further. And I'm sure that you know this, thinking back to your work in the French government. Now, this was decided before the pandemic to start this, but now it would lead to a weakening. Now, you mentioned the service industry. I don't have to go into greater depth on this, but simply say that we should be strengthening certain areas of our industry rather than weakening them. And a lot of airports and aviation industry players want a moratorium on this, and we would like that to be clear in Council too.
Yeah, okay, Mira Maria, then Antje, and then Pietro.
Thank you. Dear Commissioner, thank you very much for presenting the Commission's work related to SMEs and industrial policies. Our group president, Mr. Malia, and also you, Mr. Commissioner, highlighted the importance of enabling environments for businesses, and I think this is a crucial point for the recovery. We have to make sure that we offer business-friendly environments for the recovering companies, and we have little barriers and a lot of incentives for growth. The EU regulatory framework is a big part of this environment, and it can incentivize us or encourage businesses to grow and take up on entrepreneurship. I am slightly concerned about the regulatory burden of companies in European markets. During the past months, we have seen quite some European legislative initiatives being planned and proposed that will increase the regulatory burden of European companies, including the SMEs that are in particularly vulnerable position after the COVID crisis. Minimum wage, sustainable corporate governance, pay transparency, working conditions directive, just to mention few. And at the same time, I know that the Commission is preparing a communication on better regulation, which should ease the regulatory burden for businesses. And my question goes to you, Mr. Commissioner. What is the Commission's approach actually to the regulatory burden reduction? And what other better regulation instruments is the Commission considering to implement other than one-in, one-out tool? And how is it taking into account the impact of COVID crisis to companies in its impact assessments? Thank you.
Antje or Pietro? Please take the floor as quickly as you can, please. Antje or Pietro Dell'Otto, one of you?
Mrs. Gerstein, your microphone is open.
Can somebody guide me to the way forward, please?
Mr. Barcelo.
Mr. Barcelo, go ahead. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Stefano.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano, for the floor. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for joining us during our group meeting today. If I can just say, it feels like you're one of us. Perhaps I can pick up on a couple of points that you mentioned. First of all, in the industrial transition, and then on the internal market. On the industrial transition, there's something important here that the Commission is aware of. The cross-border transition adjustment mechanism, that's something that perhaps could be envisaged. It's difficult to implement, but European industries will therefore not have a competitive disadvantage when it comes to other countries. I know that you're aware of this, but this is something that is very much work in progress. But I really wanted to make sure that that you could tell us a bit more about this. It's an industrial topic as well, but also to do with the environment. And my second point is on the single market. I completely agree with you when you say that we need to keep the internal market running and to reinforce it, because it's a real privilege that we have it. Now, because of some of the measures that some member states are imposing, I'm afraid that some industries will have received a lot of help from member states which have big financial capacities to boost them vis-à-vis others that won't. And I believe that might be a danger, that there's a break there in terms of equality of treatment in different industries. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one final question for this round from Pietro Dell'Otto.
Thank you, Mr. President. Parlerò in italiano. Caro Commissario.
Dear Commissioner Breton, I very much welcome the fact that you're here with us today to discuss these important issues, and I liked your speech a great deal, and also the documents that you're making available. I'd like to quickly concentrate on one point, and maybe we can go into greater depth on that later. Now, autonomy, independence of strategic industries. You said that this has a knock-on effect for SMEs too, and I'd also like to briefly talk about the areas of defense and space. Now, of course, important technologies, I'm not going to list them, but important technologies need a set of instruments, a set of actions and measures that are not just political in nature, but you also need the right persons so that technological spillovers can become fundamental, and we open the door to that. Could you tell us what kind of instruments you are planning on putting in place that you see as fundamental in accompanying us on this process? Now, of course, we also have the vertical businesses in Europe, and we have industries such as space and defense. And when it comes to those, then we're quite happy together with you to look into these vertical businesses, structures and issues. But thank you for now for being with us, and I hope we will have many other opportunities to talk to you.
Mr. Commissioner, you have the floor to reply to the first set of questions. Thank you.
Peut-être juste un petit point, parce que je n'avais pas la traduction au début.
At the very start, I didn't have any interpretation. The point on aviation and aviation industry, could somebody repeat that for me? I got the end of that, but not the start of that. In relation to airline companies and the aviation industry, I didn't have interpretation for that. Could someone just tell me what was said?
Mr. Commissioner, we'll do it in the next round if you wish. I will ask Thomas to intervene again.
Alors, je vais donc reprendre les questions de Maria, d'abord sur...
First of all, the question then for Maria on one in, one out. That's a very good question. Of course, we want to reduce the bureaucratic burden. One in, one out is a start, but we want to develop an approach which is based on effectiveness and which will allow us to focus on one-stop shops and platforms, and the fact that that's already in place, and that should allow us to reduce the bureaucratic burden further. In the recovery plans, there's a part on improving matters with administration. We call that fluidity, drawing on digital technologies too. So that's something that we're promoting with a view to reducing the bureaucratic red tape for SMEs. And of course, we want to make sure that companies are not weighed down by this. So that's certainly one of our top priorities. The one in, one out is a good start, as I said, but we need to go further. And I want ICT to be used more to reduce the administrative burden, and that's certainly something that I'm working on a great deal. Then, Mr. Bronder, you had a question about the border carbon adjustment mechanisms. Well, it's important. We're working on this between now and the end of June. Of course, the level playing field is important, and that's why we work on this, but not only because of that. If we place constraints on ourselves in Europe, if that has an impact on companies, and these companies play along, by the way, most of the companies, be they large or small, have accepted the Green Deal level of ambition and the zero carbon economy by 2050. And I'd like to thank the companies for that. They are shouldering their responsibilities, and we recognize that. Most company leaders have understood this. But of course, investments will be needed. And again, the recovery plans are the right kind of instrument for that, for those investments. There will be operational costs, which might be higher than in other countries. So we need to take all of this into account and compensate for it. And that's why that's why we have this border carbon adjustment mechanism. So we need a level playing field, as I said. That's one reason for doing it. But secondly, we also need financial resources, and this will provide them. And the resources that will come from the adjustment mechanism will be used to reimburse the debt that has been taken on in the EU. And that's important too. For the first time in its history, the Commission has borrowed money quite heavily, and this to make sure that member states had resources in place, subsidies, but also low-interest loans. Of course, that money will need to be paid back. We don't want to penalize companies or citizens, however, which is why this type of adjustment mechanism can be useful. And then there's the GAFA digital tax. That too is being looked into, and that could be a further source of revenue, which will allow us to repay the debt, even though the debt that has been taken on is very long-term debt. Then Mr. Pietro Delotta, very good question on defense and space. Again, it's very important. You've told us that strategic autonomy is important for us. I agree. In particular, in relation to essential industries, the same goes for technologies. We started a period, and this period will continue, where we will have to deal with China and the US. And I continue saying that in terms of population, we're 1.5 times the size of the US. We're the first and largest market in the world. So we can't just be a variable between China and the US. We need to make it clear that we too are a force to be reckoned with, and part of that is making investments and putting money towards technologies, key technologies. So we will continue our efforts upstream, And when it comes to space and defense, then both are very important. There are synergies between the two. And there are 2 points in particular that I'd like to make here in rounding up. There's the European Defence Fund, first of all. I'm in charge of that. For the first time, the EU, the Commission, at a very upstream stage in the process, will be able to invest €1 billion per year. That leverages money to the tune of 30-40 billion euro, but we can invest at an upstream stage. And it's not just about supporting one country or another, or one country over another. All of the projects that are submitted need to be multi-country projects, including large and smaller countries. So a project with just 2 or 3 companies involved will be rejected straight away. So you need a consortium with as many companies as possible that are involved, including SMEs. That's the raison d'être of the fund. But all of the defense industries need to be involved, and all of the countries need to be involved. And small and large companies and small and large countries alike can be involved. Then space. Of course, there are a lot of dual technologies that apply for defense as they do for space. It's important to have this dual nature. It applies to connectivity. It applies to drones that can be used for civilian purposes and military purposes. But when it comes to space, in the strict sense of the word, and I'm responsible for that too, we have the €1 billion Cassini Fund, and that seeks to support startups, SMEs, the entire space sector and innovative space sectors, not just the large multinationals. It's also available to startups and SMEs, so there is some scope for experimentation. And then we'll try and put into orbit some of the products, satellites and so on. So that's the Cassini Fund. And again, this ties in with our ambition to have strategic autonomy. And we want to create an ecosystem and attract the brightest minds. And if someone has bright ideas, then please come to Europe, be part of the ecosystem. And you'll then be in a position to develop your projects. I've given you those 2 examples, but I could give you many more. But I hope they illustrate what we're trying to achieve. Again, if somebody could repeat that first question, I couldn't hear it because I didn't have interpretation. It was in relation to aviation.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thomas Kropp.
So then I go to English, perhaps it's a bit quicker. Mr. Commissioner, thank you. There is one item which is not totally on your desk, but it has already left the college, which is the EU Qatar Agreement. You know this topic very well from the French government. And now the European aviation is very concerned about this agreement because now the aviation has 10 to 20% of its capacity due to the COVID crisis. In an opinion of the EESC some weeks ago, we said that all these air trade transport agreements, which are not yet finished, this is finished because it's not finished because not in the council, have to be reviewed by the commission. The Qatar agreement is very special because here they will have the big European market with 450 million, and the European airlines would have the very tiny 1 million Qatar agreement. That was good in perhaps flourishing times, but now it would be a disaster for our industry and a very unbalanced, and it's going in the council. It will come back to the college. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Next is Antje, then Christian, Elena, and Dragica. Please take the floor after each other.
Oui, Monsieur le Commissaire, bonjour.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. I represent trade in Germany, which is another sector which is hit hard by the pandemic. My question is related to SMEs and the DMA, DSA, two major files that will be following the legislative procedure now. Do you think it would be possible to strike a balance between the needs of the large platforms and the interests of European consumers who increasingly need these types of platforms because consumers have moved online? And how can we make sure that small platforms that exist everywhere are not placed under too much pressure? They are very important, those smaller platforms, because they provide a vital infrastructure for trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I have two more concrete questions. First, I'd just like to mention that companies, I should say I represent the Swedish business in the service and industry sectors. I would like to say, first of all, that companies in Sweden are really worried about the recent developments, particularly in the social policy area, where they think that the EU is developing in the wrong direction. It's very problematic proposals that are coming in relation to competitiveness and to growth. We need to have a very good framework in Europe to attract and keep business thriving. So a question here is, how do you see to introduce, or maybe we should say to reintroduce, a really targeted competitiveness checkup before every proposal is made? I know we have checkups and we have impact assessments, but more specifically, a real competitiveness checkup. Second question is about the single market and more specifically what is being done. And if you have any proposals to challenge member states to bring down barriers to free movement. I'm talking more specifically then about the Services Directive and maybe about the regulated professions, but something about challenging member states to bring down barriers to free movement. Thank you very much.
Je vais parler en français. Cher Monsieur le Commissaire.
Commissioner, thank you very much for joining us here today, and thank you for your presentation. We appreciate having your insights in these topics that are important to us. Thank you, first of all, for your commitment in terms of arguing that non-essential travel should resume. After all, these restrictions go against the spirit of the internal market. Perhaps I could ask a question. Does the Commission envisage to take any other additional actions to apply further pressure, perhaps, or to nudge member states who apply certain restrictions, especially when these restrictions are different in neighbouring countries? So we've had the new industrial strategy for Europe that was presented not so long ago. We're talking about dual transition, digital and green. And, well, soon will be. We would have been in this situation for a year. The pandemic would have been with us for a year, and yet the same issues. There are certain people that were facing the same issues because of the lockdown measures. So there have been those who have been affected directly and those who are affected indirectly. What about the restaurant industry or the automotive industry who suffered significantly? Now, the digital and green transition won't happen without SMEs and without having them on board. So I'm sad to see that there's no revised SME strategy plan. The new industrial strategy should take account of the fact that the crisis is not over. Businesses don't have the necessary cash flow in order to make these investments for the dual transition, but they agree that it is necessary. So we want a certain level of ambition to be achieved and have the right kind of support, because the digital, green, social transition will not happen without businesses and notably SMEs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear Commissioner, thank you for finding time to be with us and to have this debate on very important issues for all of us. My colleagues before me just touched on the subject that I wanted to talk to. This is the excessive restrictions at the borders at this time of the virus that is spreading and the new variants of this virus. We can understand the governments need to protect the health and to curb the spread of the virus, but we also, all of us, we know that the economy needs to go on, and we need to trade, and the service needs to be provided. What is the problem is that these measures are not even and are different at different borders, and business operators are encountering problems. And I also appreciate that the Commission is taking seriously this problem, but we also see that last week's European Council didn't move much on this issue. So I presume that as long as this situation with the virus is like this and the vaccine is not rolled out on a more significant scale, we will have this. But I would like to see, as was already asked, are there any other measures that the commissions can do? And linked to this, of course, it is hopefully soon we will come out of this and we will start to live normally. How can we ensure that the member states coordinate the lifting of restrictions and start to have a functioning internal market, which again was not single even before this? And I would like to congratulate the Commission on many tools that it has, like the points of single contact, single market scoreboard, Solvit. You mentioned rightly Enterprise Europe Network, which has a good role, and the new single market enforcement task force. And with this, in relation with this, my next question is, how can we see that business organizations are more involved in this single market enforcement task force, which can have a very good results in identifying barriers to trade? And then, as my colleague previously also said, Christian, that is, how can we ensure, what can Commission do that rules are more implemented at member state level? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dragiga. Commissioner?
Bien, merci pour cette deuxième.
Thank you. Thank you for this second round of questions. So, Qatar Airways, yes, that first question. It's not entirely my area of expertise, it's more a transport file, but perhaps just looking at where we are, I am aware of the fact that, well, the aerospace industry is really one of the sectors that's been most impacted upon by the crisis, been directly affected because of a number of reasons. But I can't give you a direct answer to your question. I will ask my colleague, perhaps bilaterally, because it's really a bit beyond my area of expertise. But I agree, this is a very, very topical matter. It's very important, and I think that, well, my colleague with the transport portfolio would be better placed to answer this, and so I'll get in touch with her soon and to talk about this. Christian, your question about the DSA DMA. There's various issues here. Different types of information, how they're obtained, legal matters. Well, the DMA, it's an administrative tool that will enable better organization to make sure that looking at the platforms from an economic point of view, that matters continue to function soundly. You did say that big platforms are interested in SMEs, and a lot of SMEs use big platforms to sell their products. And sure, that's all good and fine, but we want to make sure that the market is as fair, fluid, and equitable as possible. There's quite a few SMEs who can't sell their products other than by going through a platform, and that's a situation where there are certain distortions from a competition point of view. Perhaps a simple example, we've seen this because the DSA DMA does address this. How about the data that that is sold, that is passed on, data collected by these type of matters are not to be taken lightly because it's illegal. This type of behavior is predatory. This type of behavior should not be allowed. It should be corrected. And so there's a certain classification there for platforms in terms of the systemic nature. And we should be mindful of this because there are certain platforms who should not be able to operate on the European market before making certain adjustments, especially when it comes to the use of data. Small platforms now, you mentioned this, they're very important. Yes, you're right. The measures that we have taken will enable for there to be when it comes to managing the ecosystem of these platforms, for it to be more dynamic. So less subject to this sort of the predatory nature of behavior or any monopolies. So we want to do away with that. The idea is to have the necessary legislation in place for it to be a sound type of system. So that's certainly the objective of the DMA. And I think, Christian, you raise an important point. And this is certainly something that my team and I are working on. It's a very important subject. And we hope that it takes off as soon as possible. Every day counts at the end of the day. Christian, on competitiveness and a better functioning of the single market. Well, on competitiveness, there's a competitiveness checkup. Indeed, it is important. We're very much on this. We're very zoomed in on this. And it's we have this in mind with every initiative that comes up on the good functioning of the single market. Well, it's a never-ending fight. That's a never-ending fight. It's always this and that obstacle. This is a daily battle. It's an uphill struggle, but there is tangible progress in sight. So that's why this task force, the SMET task force, has been set up, enabling us to have a better overview of what's happening on the ground. This task force is indeed operational. And perhaps, Elena, I'll come back to your question in a minute. It is an important subject that you have raised. It's very relevant today. And what you said was indeed very pertinent. So having personnel being able to go on the ground to have a look at the situation, and it's important to have this dimension, to have people on the ground in order to ensure that we can correct any difficulties as they arise. Elena, the issues you raised are very important, certainly on the industrial strategy. We're not going to change industrial strategy, overnight. It's not something that changes with chop and change with. It's got to be sound. It's something that has to be we have to make sure that just going back to your question, of course the crisis is not over. Our member states are still going through this crisis, so the industrial strategy should be a sound strategy that helps us make progress even in these difficult times. So we have to look at it from the point of view of own resources, cash flows, and flanking measures towards the green transition. We can see that in terms of recovery, we need to look at this from different angles, because across different countries, different industries, because of the lockdown measures, there have been very important changes, namely in digitalization. What that means is that it means a new wave of training, etc. And it's very significant. It's very significant for SMEs. And it's something that needs to be borne in mind when we review the industrial strategy. It's not going to be something that's going to change. As you know, businesses need visibility and businesses need stability. So it's not going to be something that's going to be hugely different. But there will be additional measures to enable businesses to stay afloat. And that's going to be something that we're going to bear in mind. And in April, you'll have more information on this. Now, on the various restrictions that have been put in place in the internal market, the barriers, etc. Of course, who can argue against certain measures? Perhaps behaviors are justified. Because member states that say that there are certain health-related matters that are very important. I myself was a minister, so I know how these things, how difficult it is to take political decisions, and all the more difficult in this particular context. That having been said, here we do have the sort of continent to think about, and the health situation is not the same in every country. Things differ from member state to member state, and we have to be mindful of how the pandemic is evolving. Hopefully we'll see an end to it soon, but there are various issues here. There are clusters, etc. So we have to look at the way in which political bodies have taken decisions that have an impact on what happens on the ground. It's sometimes not even a decision that's taken at member state level. It's regional decisions and measures that have been taken because the situation is not as good as it could be. Now, we saw the situation on the border, Italy, Austria, for example. We saw it with Czechia as well, Germany. There are a number of areas where the health situation has led to perhaps a need for greater, to take greater precautions. So what we need to do is to make sure that the means that we make available are the same to all, so that in spite of all of these different restrictions, we can have similar levels of support. The President made an announcement this morning because there comes a point when you need to cross borders for whatever reason, and there are some areas that of course have been more affected by the pandemic, but you do need to have a number of procedures, constraints in place, but also opportunities to see how this can be dealt with. So this green digital health space needs to be taken into account. There are various other factors to take into account, and there could be different measures that are taken here. Sometimes there are different testing requirements in terms of crossing borders. So yes, there are different issues to bear in mind. Indeed, we do need to be mindful of the future months as well, in terms of what's going to happen from a tourist point of view as well, and what the future outlook is in the coming months. Sure, we're going to have a few coming months that are going to be quite difficult. The solution, of course, could be that that vaccination rates pick up the pace and so on. And we need to make sure that the vaccines reach the people that they need to reach. Vaccines have been approved. They have to be redirected and deployed there where they are being waited for. So this is work that's ongoing. I hope that we'll get there. We're still going to have a few couple of months that are still a bit difficult. We've had the various difficulties in terms of production capacity, so we want to make sure that we increase that capacity as much as possible. And so in terms of manufacturing, the right number of doses in Europe, that is important. It's important for us to be able to be prepared here and for the future as well. So we're taking quite big steps towards digitalization and the digital era, and hopefully with that we'll be able to go through this difficult time so that we can reach perhaps a new kind of normal. And that's what I can tell you this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I understand your time is overdue. So you are certainly due our thanks. Really appreciate the time you have given us and also the discussion. As you can see, there's a lot of interest, and I can assure you that there was double the amount of people still wanting to ask you more questions. So to me, that indicates that we will need to organize something similar in the months to come, especially in view of the various developments that we'll have. But thank you once again, and I will be contacting you via email so that we can organize something in the near future.
It will be with pleasure, and thank you very much for all of you. Thank you for your commitment, and thank you for your service for Europe. I know that you have all of you have a lot of activities, but you spend some time also for Europe. So I would like to thank you for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you once again, and good luck.
Thank